My soul cries out with a joy.
Last time we looked at Glen Muckloch, where the ugliest of scarred landscapes, the brownest of brownfield sites, the source of dirty energy and burning coal is about to be transformed into a wind-powered pumped storage hydro station for clean energy. This time is something very different and on a much greater scale, to break this ground and flood this glen to power our lives. Is that appalling? Maybe. Though aren't we doing worse already? Maybe it's damned if you do, but it's certainly damned if you don't. At first hearing, there seems to be little in the encouragements and insults and terrifying predictions of John the Baptist, little to inspire ease in what Luke describes as good news. Though John is far from a prophet of doom, John is a vandal of barriers, kicking sand out of our eyes, the sand that we have stuck our heads in, ripping off the wool we've pulled over our own eyes, though in the bright light of truth, we're wont to scrabble around for something to replace it. In John's perception of crisis, there is still just about something to play for, even though damage is done, and especially because his hearers have been complicit in that. That's justice. The polluter pays, the oppressor empowers. That's good news. To the extent that we are the cause, our repentance is the right response. And perhaps you expected me to say the right solution. But like vengeance, solutions are God's alone. Response is all we can offer to prepare the way. And whatever your place in society or the churches, without either rebellion or encouragement of some kind from grassroots, our leaders for whom the environment is not always the day job, our leaders will continue to spout language, attitudes, and even prayers from before we knew so very well of the harm that we truly do. And so in faithfulness, we respond. We speak out. We maybe stick our necks out, and we will get some things wrong. We already have a snake or two on the board, but the game is still on. We will harm beauty, though our starting point is that war on creation, which daily and already makes of earth a scarred and stinking battlefield. We know very well that we won't do nothing, even if we pass off that war as prudent hesitation. And so, to make of an open-cast mine a resource of clean energy looks like wisdom. To flood the beauty of a greenfield glen should at least give pause for thought, if only of the costs we've ignored until now because they are out of sight, out of mind. Like the slaughterhouse behind the bacon, like the floods, droughts, death and injustice behind fossil fuels, and the sweatshops and scars of mining for battery minerals for low-emission transport. Doing no harm is a lie. Doing less harm is a responsible calling, a demanding discipline, set about with the devil's excuses. Again, we're damned if we do, but we are damned if we don't. But as for our motivation, well, isn't that between each soul and God? John, who's preparing the way, insists perhaps less that hearers change their hearts and minds, but instead, and above all, for their own good, that they act as if they had done. And this is why, for all its faults, net zero can be good news. Why loss and damage, the movement to finance mitigation of environmental harm caused by fossil fuels, is good news. Because even moderately just action, sharing your spare coat and any food beyond your own needs, begins to make this world a better place for life. Prayer begins to be answered. Begins. But I'm attached to that spare coat And I've set aside extra food for rainy days. But friends, look outside, it is pouring, and your neighbours are out in it, even the human ones. And you might long to walk this glen before the water's 20 metres over your head, or delight in this loch before their waters rise and fall to accommodate dips in renewable power so we can put the kettle on when we're watching a football match. The result is scarring the brae, saving the climate. Damned if you do, but damned if you don't. And we realise that as it stands, it's going to be commercial rather than spiritual or conservation interests that carry the day over which glen we flood, which loch we dam and which we conserve. Just because you're committed to care of creation, that does not mean that you're exempt from those dilemmas that we smugly expect to be faced by those who are still promoting fossil fuels. We can't become green Pharisees. God can and perhaps does make environmentalists from these stones. Now, that spare coat, the surplus food, the landscape and the habitat which isn't our own home, these obvious things are, if you like, scope one of sacrifice. A little skin off our nose. Though with eyes wide open, redemption is by the skin of our teeth. Ignoring what's plain to see, as Pope Francis so forcefully pointed out last year, is culpable foolishness. And I've been asked, is this sin? Yes, of course it's sin. Call a spade a spade. The foolishness God doesn't save you from except in the good news of warnings. Soldiers and tax collectors come, but nor does John the Baptist's tirade permit our recognition of the mess, our recognition of the responsibility for the mess we've made, to become an excuse for stepping back from it, for wringing hands and shedding tears as an end in themselves, even if it's our own culture's violence and injustice that we lament, that has caused the urgent threats that hang over us. How seldom still do polluters pay? But somewhere there's a path, because there are resting places along the way. Rest and refreshment are an integral part of any planned activity. Think of nourishment. Think of healthy living as complementary to active discipleship, certainly not opposite. We breathe out and we also breathe in, or we die. And nowhere in John the Baptist's good news do we hear that toxic lie. Everything's going to be all right anyway. But though redemption is the long game, you don't have to wait around to throw a six before you get started. You only have to be sufficiently informed to be convinced and to trust that you are on the right track, pending better insights. So penance, repentance is a process with a purpose. And lament cannot be lifelong, but it can lead to healing. John the Baptist, the coach, the preparer of the way, offers not the end game of solutions, but the urgency of active response right now, which cannot responsibly wait for perfection. Though yet again, one more yet again, if something really is broke, then do fix it, if that's within the bounds of possibility. And that's why, like it or not, I'm compelled to choose carefully the language and the strategies of environmental mission. On John's model, what is it that will actually help us to move on rather than just stay where we are? But not to lean so far backwards in an attempt to curry favour that I fall backwards into the same mud that threatens to suck us all in. And I know that in every church I visit, there will be folks who are hearing or acknowledging for the first time the profound spiritual urgency of response in prayerful action to the crises of nature and climate which continue to be caused by the injustices of exploitative fossil fuel culture on which we're told we depend. Now, if that's you, Here for the first time, welcome, dear friend, and if that's your neighbour, love them and help them on the way, and love yourself in the action you embrace. Globally and indisputably, life on Earth now suffers the results of evading what was sufficiently well known at the beginnings of the COP conferences. 29 COPs in. There is progress, not nearly enough, but without those gatherings, things could have been far worse. John is also scathing about entitlement, that looking down, leave it to us attitude from the same tribe as colonialism. It saves no one to stand on a ceremonial or racial status as a platform to ignore warnings like John's. And indeed, the contempt, not just historically and not just culturally expressed in genocide, the contempt for the wisdom of indigenous peoples and our dependence on fellow creatures and ecosystems, that contempt is lethal, and it's lethal ultimately to all. Now, this Advent, John, the prophet of doing less harm and getting on with it, is providentially paired with the active reassurance of Zephaniah, in whose words God sweeps aside all those inhibitions and disablements that come with having messed things up, so that no excuse remains but to engage full tilt for justice. Not to let our hands grow weak, though that spiritual nourishment we often allow to sound futile when we label it religion, religion will be part of this. Encouragement, solidarity, and confronting even rational despair. Set free to take the risk of action. So we've looked at the projects at Cruachan, where following a literally groundbreaking transformation of the landscape, the enslavement of the power of a waterfall, clean energy has for a lifetime filled the gap which now is left by intermittent sources like tide, wind and solar. We've seen Glen Muckloch, the brownfield, Loch na Harbour, the green. We take these journeys because Advent is a season of preparation, not a season of resting on laurels. It's a countdown to take off rather than a wind down to inaction. And given the prominent place of John in Advent readings, this season becomes a slip road to the holy highway. And not even the birth or the public identification by John of the Messiah is a destination, not a place to remain. Christ, after all, says, I am the way. Finally, it's not helpful to us, nor does it do justice to John's vision, to concentrate on whether or not the urgency of John's message was justified by historical events of his day and age. Our time, our age, is one, perhaps one of many, when good news takes that form of warning. Good news is news to act on.
My heart shall sing of the day bring, let the fire of your justice burn. Wipe away all tears, for the dawn draws near and the world is about